Why exercise? Which exercise? How does our body respond to exercise? What are normal training effects? How do I train? How do I test? Coming up in Friday Physiology. In healthy people, but also in cardiac rehabilitation, endurance training has shown many positive effects. Just to name a few: underlying physiological improvements, capillary density, plasma volume, O2 supply, blood flow, left ventricular function, and we can go on and on. Blood pressure, blood lipid values, body fat, glucose control, and even stress levels. Although we will mainly focus on the classic exercise physiology, it's good to note that in cardiac rehab, exercise is only one aspect of the entire program. Counseling and other lifestyle interventions really make it a true interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach. That's for later. We will dive into the world of exercise physiology. Before we look into the effects of exercise and training, it's good to emphasize the difference between the terms. Because in the graphs that I will show you, sometimes you see acute effects of exercise and sometimes you see chronic adaptations due to training. For example, heart rate during exercise is usually higher than at rest, yet a resting heart rate after 3 months of proper endurance training is often lower than now before training. In the next graphs, you will see the effect of exercise intensity and the effect of training, both merged into the same graphs. Let's have a look. In this table, you can find the effects of exercise. Cardiac output, heart rate, and stroke volume all increase in exercise compared to rest. Your body needs more energy, you need to have more blood pumping around, heart rate goes up, stroke volume goes up, and cardiac output goes up. See the response of the VO2, the oxygen consumption, in time, comparing different intensities. You can see at the bottom 50 watts, and as you see the intensity, for instance on the stationary bike, increase, you see that it takes a little bit more time, and also the steady state will be a little bit higher. The oxygen uptake you can see on the left, ranging from, let's say, 1 liters a minute for very low intensity exercise, all the way to 3 or 3.5 for higher intensity exercise. All these exercises are still considered submaximal, so that you can expect this steady value for the heart rate for at least the last few minutes of the exercise. In this graph, you can see on the y-axis, the vertical axis, the VO2, in this example expressed in milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. On the horizontal axis, you can see the speed. So imagine that this is an experiment on a treadmill where they have measured the oxygen uptake, oxygen consumption, as we call it, in relation to speed. The blue line is the line that represents the values of a person before training, while the red line shows the same person's values post-training. And imagine that this is a 3-month training program to hopefully improve VO2 max. And that's what the graph also shows. You can see that during a max test where you gradually increase the speed, you can see that VO2 levels rise accordingly. Post-training, VO2 max values have reached higher values than before training. Yet you can see that the relationship is still more or less the same linear relationship between speed and VO2. In this graph, you can see the VO2 consumption expressed in relation to time. On the horizontal axis, you can see time. On the vertical axis, you can see O2 consumption. Now, the idea is that if you do steady state exercise, for example, biking at 150 watts, then from the start of the exercise, your body requires a certain amount of energy. That energy translates to a certain amount of O2, so that's the requirement that you need from the start. Then the body just needs a few minutes to get to that new steady state level. So that is then in literature considered the O2 deficit. So basically your body is spending a certain amount of energy that is not yet generated completely through the aerobic pathways. Now, for the steady state exercise, you can see that the O2 consumption matches the requirement, And then again, at the end of the exercise, you would expect the O2 consumption to drop all the way to rest because the exercise is over. But there you see the opposite. You can see that although there's no energy required to pedal on the bike, the VO2 gradually lowers, and that volume, that surface underneath that graph is defined as the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC, and that is in literature often a reflection of the deficit that is required at the start. What is interesting to note is that a normal training effect is also for the VO2 and the heart rate to rise more quickly to that required steady state, so the body is quickly ready for that steady level, and the deficit, if you may call it like this, is actually minimized. So now we really get into the difference between exercise versus training, immediate effects versus chronic adaptations that occur during exercise. The first graph is a very nice graph that expresses the cardiac output on the y-axis, the vertical axis, and the work rate on the horizontal axis. So that represents the intensity. The orange graph, the orange line shows the untrained values, and the green one, basically showing just behind the orange one, shows the trained values. So here you can see that cardiac output at maximum intensities definitely is higher in trained people compared to that same person being untrained. Yet the relationship at submaximal intensities is exactly the same. There's a linear relationship that is not affected by training. If you look at heart rate, there you see a big difference, a very systematic difference at every single intensity. So the work rate, as the work rate increases, heart rate also increases, but at any given intensity, you can see that the green line, the trained value, shows a lower value than the orange line. So heart rate at any intensity for a trained person is expected to be lower than for an untrained person. How can we explain the two? Well, that must be attributed to stroke volume, and that's what this last graph is telling us. On the horizontal axis, you can again see the intensity, now expressed in O2 consumption related to work rate, while on the vertical axis, you can now see stroke volume. And if we neglect the higher intensities, you can see that stroke volume rises until a certain point for both untrained and trained persons, but the trained values are at any given intensity higher than the untrained values. So what does that mean? Simply the heart has grown both in volume and in strength of contraction in order to have a higher stroke volume for every single stroke. So what can be trained? Well, if you look at the heart rate, then we often use this very simple rule if we don't really have a true maximum heart rate measured. And although we're always wrong if we do this H estimation, if you do not have a maximal exercise test, then this might be the only way to go. The rule is 220 minus H, so it shows that as you grow older, every single year your heart rate is expected to reduce. So for elderly people, simply because of this H estimation, you can already expect that also cardiac output and maximal oxygen consumption is reduced by H, and that increases, that decline continues as you grow older. In the next graph, you can see heart rate versus intensity. You can see on the horizontal axis treadmill speed, and again on the vertical axis heart rate. A nice linear relationship exists, so as long as you keep pushing up the treadmill speed while someone is running, at some point you will see that someone will reach their max. And they might be able to continue for a little bit longer at a higher speed, but the plateau in the heart rate value shows that this is clearly someone's true maximum heart rate. Now, compared to the H estimation, this is by far the best measure because it truly reflects the actual maximum heart rate of this person. In this graph, you can see stroke volume and training effects. On the horizontal axis, you can see treadmill, while on treadmill speed, while on the vertical axis you can see stroke volume, and the blue line shows pre-training while the red line shows post-training. And as the intensity goes up, you can see that for both trained and untrained people, stroke volume goes up while Trained people post-training always have a higher stroke volume, and their maximum stroke volume has increased, which corresponds to a higher treadmill speed that they can reach at maximum intensity. An important factor to keep in mind is gravity whenever we look at stroke volume. So if you look at the difference in the stroke volume for supine positions versus the stroke volume in upright positions, you can see a difference, and that difference is mainly attributed to gravity. So end systolic volume as well as end diastolic volume are a little bit lower for people that are measured upright, while in supine positions the difference between end systolic volume and end diastolic volume, being stroke volume, is bigger. So keep that in mind if you measure someone's resting heart rate, for instance, because if you would measure this in supine or upright, you can already expect a difference simply because of gravity. If you look at this table, you can see average values at rest. For a physio, it's always important to understand what is normal and what is abnormal. What do you expect from a trained person and what do you expect from an untrained person? In this table, you can see that if you just neglect body size, males and females are identical. At rest, for someone untrained, you would expect a heart rate of around 70 beats per minute, while stroke volume could be like 70, which will lead as a product to cardiac output of about 5 liters. Now, if someone would be trained, you would still expect in rest more or less the same cardiac output because more or less the same amount of energy is required. But because the increase in stroke volume is clearly there, 90 versus 70, you can live with a lower resting heart rate. And that is what we can measure in daily life. If you then look at the difference between rest and max exercise, you can see a huge difference. Heart rate can reach its max, stroke volume can reach its max. If you take the product of these two, you can see that cardiac output can reach up to values of 30 liters a minute compared to only 5 liters a minute at rest. That was it. That was your introduction into exercise physiology. This was Physiology Friday. See you soon.